Hi, everybody. Just going to wait a little bit for people to join in. Hope everyone's doing well. Today we're going to have a lot of things to talk about. I'm going to just briefly talk a little bit about the Ukrainian initiatives that Immigration Canada has been putting together. And then after, we're going to go into a Q&A. So just an introduction for some people who are slowly trickling in. My name is Nadia Bakhtiari. I'm one of the associate lawyers at Visa Place Legal in Toronto, Ontario. I'm a Canadian immigration lawyer, so if you have any questions on the US side, you can always reach out to our firm afterwards because we do also operate in US immigration law. But today we will, of course, be focusing on Canadian immigration, some questions that you guys have, and see what we can do to kind of get your foot through the door. So after this session, you can always reach out to the firm, reach out to intake, to reception, let them know that you wanted to discuss a little bit further with any questions and things that you might have. Okay. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to be doing a large part of this is going to be Q&As. So if you wouldn't mind, you could just comment your questions in this live, and someone will be taking note of them, and I'll try to get through them as quickly as possible. We'll do some of the questions and answers afterwards as well. Okay. All right, so we have about 14 people here, and I think we're just going to start a little bit in terms of a recap on the Ukrainian session. What has changed in the past 2 weeks is quite significant for Ukrainian people in terms of Immigration Canada. So first off, let's talk a little bit about whether you have a Ukrainian citizen who is an immediate family member of yours. An immediate family member means a spouse, a child, a parent, or that would essentially be covering it. So inevitably, those things are prioritized. You would have an application that you can submit through sponsorship, and it absolutely will be prioritized. The best way to do it is in any application you send through, you want to just mention Ukraine 2022, and that's the way that your application is going to push forward. Besides that, we also have the option of the electronic travel authorization. So the electronic travel authorization is for any Ukrainians or anybody that you know who is a Ukrainian citizen who is in Ukraine or in Poland, where most people have seemed to flee to a little bit for safety. So this is applicable information to them. Even if they do not have connections to Canada, they are still eligible for this new electronic authorization. And the wonderful thing about the authorization, again, is that it's significantly prioritized. So generally, when you apply for temporary residence or temporary visits into Canada, it can take up to a few weeks, and sometimes a few months. In this case, it will likely be in under 2 or 3 weeks based off what we can see. But of course, that is going to be something we discover as it goes on, particularly because the program just came out last week. So as well as the electronic travel authorization for temporary visits, you can also apply for an open work permit if you're Ukrainian. And that open work permit can be valid for about 2 or 3 years inside of Canada, and you can come with your family as well. So it's an excellent program. It's definitely something to take advantage of. There is a portal that has been set up. And in that portal, that's where you'd be able to apply for it. So the program has a specific name, and the name is basically an acronym for Canada Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel. So, in case you look online, the acronym is CUAET, and it has its own designated portal in which you would be eligible to apply for electronic travel authorization. Now, the last benefit to this, of course, is how easy it is to apply. The Ukrainian Canadian authorization has been set in a way where it's not going to require the same documentation a TRV would. It doesn't require a purpose of visit or invitation letter. It doesn't require proof of funds necessarily. If you are not able to show it, you can always show an exemption for it. It's very straightforward, and I really recommend that anyone who's interested in it, who's a Ukrainian national, or if you know someone who is and might need a little bit of safety until the situation ceases to be dangerous for Ukrainian people, then at that point, definitely encourage them to look up the Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel. So I'll probably go through the Ukrainian situation just one more time at the end for anyone who's missed it, because it is obviously very important. But for now, what we're going to do, last time I was on here, we focused a little bit on specific topics. This time, I think we're going to focus a little bit about questions, and we're going to really treat this like a Q&A. So any questions that you have, make sure you include a little bit of detail, and then I'll try to get through as many of the answers as possible, given obviously with the limited fact patterns that I'll have in the questions you'll be asking me. So just to recap again for the new people that are joining in, my name is Nadia, and I'm one of the associate lawyers at Visa Place. And Visa Place is an immigration law firm in Toronto, Ontario. We have multiple lawyers, consultants, legal assistants, caseworkers that work both on the US side and the Canadian side. But for today's purposes, we are going to just go through some of the Canadian questions that we have. Okay. So I'm going to start with the first question that I see, which is, I have a refusal from Canada. So what can I do? I also have the notes for it. First off, you're on the first right track. The best thing when you get a refusal is to look at the reasons for refusal. Unfortunately, a lot of the times when it comes to refusals, there are a few uncontrollable factors, like things like quotas at visa offices, determination on discretion, which essentially means that an officer can take a look at an application and there could be something that them personally they just didn't find convincing. The disadvantage of temporary applications is that it is discretionary. There's no exact rule or procedure you need to follow to get an approval. Instead, you need to focus on, if I was an officer, have I convinced the officer that I'm going to be a genuine student or a genuine worker or genuine visitor? And how have I provided the supporting documentation to show that? Now, coming back to that question, the best thing to do is to get a copy of something called ATIP notes. ATIP is Access to Information and Privacy Act, and it's also known as GCMS notes. So GCMS notes cost $5 to withdraw from immigration. And this is $5 not as a filing fee, but as an actual immigration fee that they charge. You do need to be a permanent resident or citizen of Canada to be able to pull ATIP notes, but that's certainly the first best step. Now, generally with ATIP notes, when you're looking at refusals, they're generally in the last few pages. It can be very overwhelming when you first get a copy of them. But my recommendation, just go through, perhaps it's the last 5 pages. You'll see a little decision with various information. It could be a few sentences, it could be half a page as to the reason for the refusal. When you go through those reasons, you want to compare it versus what you submitted and take a look at whether this is manageable for you to convince the officer on reapplication. Now, the best way to convince an officer on reapplication is through supplying documentation that you noticed was missing. So, for example, if they say that you showed no ties to your home country, then maybe on reapplication, you want to think of having a copy of your home property. Maybe you want to have a copy of reference letters, things like that that really satisfy any concerns of ties to your home country. But you're on the right track. My suggestion would, of course, be just focus on what's written in the ATIP notes, and then see if it's reasonable and something you can do in order to reapply. Okay. Next, we have how can I get a work visa to Canada? This is a very common question. It's unfortunately a little open-ended. There are a multitude of ways, and I'll try to touch on everything that I can think of in terms of how to get a work permit to come to Canada. I'll start with the most obvious one, which is something called LMIAs. And LMIAs are labor market impact assessments, and these are employer-specific work permits. So essentially, what it would require is to have a job offer in a skilled position in Canada. And if you have an employer who's willing to help you through that process, then that's certainly the most common way to do it. Inevitably, for a lot of people, it's very hard to find work authorization or a work or job offer when you're in Canada, especially if you don't have the authorization to work. But I find that, in my personal opinion, the best way to do it is either through any connections that you might have to help you through the door, or with bigger companies that have the resources to do kind of in-house immigration work. So things like, the Googles and Amazons of the world, they have a lot of in-house resources and are more willing to hire international workers. The second option in terms of work permits is an open work permit that is tied to a permanent residence application. This is not necessarily an option for people who are outside of the country, but for anyone who's inside of the country, you are eligible for an open work permit if you have a permanent residence application in process for certain applications. So if you have a spousal sponsorship or a common law application and you're inside of Canada, you're eligible for an open work permit. If you have a Canadian experience class permanent residence application in process, you are eligible for an open work permit. So those are some of the examples in which you could get the open work permit through PR applications. Another option is something called a temporary resident permit. This is different than a temporary resident visa, and it's for people who are inadmissible for some reason in Canada and they cannot get a work permit or work authorization otherwise. So, for example, if you have any criminality, if you are out of status, if you studied while you were here and you didn't have a study permit, then you're eligible to apply for an open work permit along with your temporary resident permit. The last thing that I'll mention in terms of employer-specific work permits is a new program that has actually been in place for COVID, and it's been extended for a little bit, which is if you're a visitor inside of Canada, you're eligible to apply for an LMIA from inside of Canada as well. Now, the very last work permit I can think of if you're outside of Canada has to do with some of the programs that Canada has in place with specific countries. So, for example, something like the International Experience Class, those are generally for some of the European countries. A TN visa, which is essentially the program that US and Canada have that allows you to come through in a skilled position if you have a job offer. And then there's a few LMI exempt work permits that you can apply for if you're outside of Canada. Again, it does depend on your country of residence. Something like Australia, they have strong programs for LMIA exempt if you're outside of Canada. Okay. Moving on to some of the next questions. What do I need to go to school in Canada? That's a good question. It can be, we'll start with a little bit of a basic question and answer for that. So the number one thing that you need is an unconditional acceptance letter. So if you are applying to schools in Canada, you cannot apply for a study permit until you have a letter of acceptance from a school. Some of the letters of acceptance you'll notice say conditional acceptance based on so-and-so. Most commonly, it is an IELTS score. So the school will say, we'll give you a conditional acceptance and it's unconditional as long as you provide us with an IELTS score of something like 6 or 6.5. So once you're able to provide that, then you would be eligible to now start the process of applying for a study permit. The second most important thing with the study permit are proof of funds. Proof of funds that are required for study permit application is about 10,000 Canadian dollars. And there's a lot of ways that you can show that you have this 10,000 Canadian, as well as ways that you can demonstrate you'd be able to afford the expenses that are involved as an international student. So for example, if you've paid off your first semester of tuition, if you just want to show a copy of your bank or investment account, and those are just some of the examples that we have. From there, to apply for a study permit, The rest of it has to do with some supporting documentation. So things like obviously your passport, proper travel authorization, proof of ties, a study plan, and those kinds of things. But the number two most important things have to do with your unconditional acceptance letter as well as your proof of funds. Okay. Moving on to the next question. I lived in Canada for over 10 years and was a landed immigrant. How can I go back? Whoever wrote this question, if you wouldn't mind just providing with me with a little bit more detail, I'm going to answer the question assuming what I think you mean, which is that you were previously a permanent resident of Canada, you lived here for 10 years, you left Canada, and now you haven't fulfilled your residency, your PR card is expired. How can I come back? This is a very big question, if that is what you're asking. In the case that it is, then there are two obvious reasons. Number one is a PR renewal on H&C, and the other one is PR travel document on H&C. I can see that the person wrote, I was there as part of a couple and we are divorced. All right, so same thing kind of stands. The first option is a PR renewal on humanitarian grounds or a PR renewal on a PR travel document on humanitarian grounds. So perhaps throughout this video, I'm going to be referencing something called H&C. And what that stands for is humanitarian and compassionate considerations. So this is a really good option for people who do not meet the residency requirement. There has to be humanitarian and compassionate reasons as to why you couldn't and why you had to stay away. So the reason why you had to stay away is has to be something like a medical reason. It has to be something like you didn't have the resources to stay in Canada. They do have to be a bit of compassionate purposes. Now, in terms of the second option, the easiest option is if you still maintain your permanent residency, if it has not been rescinded or revoked by you, then if you're a US citizen, you can drive into Canada through a private vehicle on an expired PR card. And in that sense, you would be able to re-enter Canada as a permanent resident. So the law stands by saying that permanent residents need valid PR cards or travel documents if they are flying into Canada. If they are driving into Canada by private vehicle, they just need proof that they are still permanent residents. So an expired PR card, your confirmation of PR, or your record of landing will be just fine. Inevitably, they will give you a little bit of a hard time. So you just want to make sure you have an entry package with you. You have all the supporting documentation. So those are the reasons in terms of how you can come back. Okay. In terms of the next question, I was born in the USA in 1956, and I've lived in Canada since then. I have dual citizenship, both American and Canadian passport. I'm married to a Canadian citizen for over 40 years. How hard is it to move to USA and with no vaccination? This is a US question, so I unfortunately won't be able to answer it. What I recommend doing is likely reaching out and scheduling a consultation, because we do US matters, but I'm unfortunately licensed in Canada, so I won't be able to help you out too much. But I'm sure there's a reasonable solution for that. Now for the next one, I got admission to study at a Canadian university for fall. Is it advisable to apply for my study visa and my spouse apply for an open work permit at the same time? Or I should apply first and he applies later? What are the success rates if you do it together or separately? That's an excellent question. It really varies. So what I find, honestly, is the best approach when dealing with immigration is genuineness and honesty. So when you're applying for a study permit, if it does make sense and you really do want to make sure that you're showing the full facts at the forefront, I would recommend applying with your spouse, as long as there's a reasonable reason why they want to come with you. So for example, I had a client who had a minor child and was married. So in their case, it made complete sense why the spouse and the child would also be accompanying on an open work permit or visitor visa. Because if you have a minor child, you don't want to be away from your child for 2 to 4 years, however it could be. And it's not an unreasonable claim for any officer to look at that and say, okay, that makes sense why someone who's applying for a study permit also wants to have accompanying temporary documents. So it really depends on the context. I would usually recommend that you apply together and just have the argumentation as to why you want your partner to come with you. I know the obvious answer is obviously you want your partner to be with you, but you do need to provide a little bit of more information as to why they should come. I don't really think there is a difference in acceptance rates between whether you apply separately or together. Um, I don't think that study permits get refused based on the fact that your partner applied for an open work permit, because they have the right to do that. So if an immigration officer is refusing you based on the fact that your partner is going to be accompanying, then that's in violation of the immigration acts and regulations that they are allowed to practice within. So I probably would recommend you apply together, but there is no harm done if you don't feel comfortable with that and feel a little bit more comfortable with, okay, first I'm going to apply for a study permit and later look into my partner applying for an open work permit when I'm in Canada. That's completely fine too. Just make sure you're always addressing the main things, which is purpose of visit, ties back home, and compliance. Okay, let's keep going. These questions are long today, so I just need a little bit of time to read through them. My knock code is 3113 dentist. If I get a job offer in other fields not related to my knock, will I be able to claim points for employment arrangement in my EE profile? Let me take a look at this. It depends. I don't know if I can necessarily answer this because I don't have your full profile to take a look at. But your job offer, I mean, it depends. Are you inside of Canada? Are you outside of Canada? Is it the job that you're claiming points for right now? Whoever wrote this question, if you wouldn't mind just providing a little bit more detail, and I'll take a look at that one again. Another question I have is what programs are available for Ukrainian refugees? So we took a little bit of time to talk about the Ukrainian situation in the beginning. And I'm going to repeat it now because it's good timing. We're about halfway through. So there are two different things to focus on, but the number one priority immigration has put is called an Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel. So this is actually a temporary application that's being put up, and it's essentially like a visitor visa, but you are able to stay for a few large amount of time, as well as be eligible to apply for an open work permit. The reason why I think they've put this program together instead of focusing a little bit more on refugee status is because I think Canada suspects that over time Ukrainians are going to want to go back to their home country, whether that's going to be in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. Whereas when you apply for a refugee claim, essentially you should not return back to your country of citizenship until you have valid reason to do so, but you would be potentially completely jeopardizing your refugee status if you were to go back. So I think that's the reason why immigration has put it this way, is because they assume, I think, that most Ukrainian people will be looking to go back in a few years. And if they're applying for refugee status, that might limit them a little bit. So if you have any Ukrainian friends who are looking for some protection inside of Canada, then the first thing they should look at is the Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel, which they can apply for from inside of Canada or outside of Canada. And they are eligible to apply for an open work permit for up to 3 years. Now, the other thing to note is with regards to the refugee claims for Ukrainian people, and it's all very brand new, but as myself, who's kind of looking at what the refugee response is, it's likely that Ukrainian people would fall under Section 97, people in need of protection, rather than necessarily persecuted people. And the reason for that is because the reason of their displacement has to do with a general war that is countrywide. And in that case, it is likely that you're going to want to take a look at some factors like, is this person outspoken against the government? Has this person been targeted before? Is the violence close to their area of living? the answers are generally going to be yes, your life is in danger, but it's all very brand new on the refugee side, and it's evident that immigration is trying to push the authorization a little bit more. All right, in terms of next questions, is it advisable to change the course when applying if study visa refused on current employment, future job prospects, and also in GCMS notes, it says deteriorating economic conditions in country of residence? All right, let me break this up in two parts. So the first half of the question is it advisable to change my program of study if my study visa was refused based on my current employment? So what that really looks like, for example, is let's say that you are someone who was studying marketing and your experience is in marketing, but you want to go and study a program that's graphic design. So it's a little bit different. And a lot of the times refusals will come because officers will say, well, this doesn't relate to your employment. This doesn't relate to your career plan. It doesn't really make sense why you want to study graphic design. So before you change your course, I would absolutely try to look at a client and see, is this genuinely what you want to do? Or are you just looking to get kind of a general sense of studies inside of Canada? And if it's seriously something you want to do, I would not just change the course. I would instead look at how you've applied and see how you can do better. So, for example, if you provided a study plan, in your study plan, did you mention why you're switching courses? Do you have a reference letter or any other supporting documentation that shows why you want to switch a little bit in your career path? So I would probably focus on that first before just automatically changing your course. Also, just keep in mind that immigration can see your past refusals and past applications. So if you're constantly switching courses, it's probably going to look like you're not a genuine student. Now, the second part of that question was based on deteriorating economic conditions in country of residence. Just as a personal opinion, I think it's a little unfair that they say that. Instead, what I would say is the best way to tackle that comment would be to show your own proof of funds and show that, okay, irrespectively of how potentially the country is suffering or it's not in the best socioeconomic situation, I personally am. I have a comfortable proof of funds. I own property. My family is steadily established in my country of residence. And that way, that's probably the best way to address that. Okay. The next question we have, I'm a counselor with NOC code 4143, which is family, marriage, and other related counselors. I'm currently in Vancouver with an ETA as a visitor. What can I do to work here? If this person can just type again and tell me what their country of citizenship is, maybe I can advise you to take a look at some things. But besides that, what you can do with the NOC code 4153, if it is a NOC that is either A, B, or 0, you can try to take a look at applying through permanent residency on either, if you have Canadian work experience, then that would be Canadian experience class, but otherwise federal skilled worker, which you can apply for from inside of Canada. And then from there, you can look at applying for PR, but it will probably be a little bit long for you to get that. In terms of work authorization, the number one answer is, of course, a job offer. If you find someone who's willing to hire you in a specific role, particularly if it's not code A, B, or 0, then that would be best in order for you to obtain a job offer. Now, the reason why I say your country of citizenship is because I want to see if you have potentially are from a country that has a little bit of these exchange programs. So, for example, if you're from the UK, if you're from the US, if you're from Australia, then there's a lot of really easy LMIA exempt programs that you can get done. Okay. Another one we have is I'm originally from Hungary. My mom is as well, and my son has a Portuguese passport. What do we need to immigrate to Canada and on what budget? It's a little bit of a broad question. I don't know if I can go through every single option, but the number one thing I always suggest to clients is first start to see if you qualify as a skilled worker. Skilled worker is excellent because it's very straightforward. It's not discretionary. You do have the ability to apply for it in 2 stages, and eventually you would be able to enter Canada as a permanent resident. So, absolutely, the first thing I would do is probably look at skilled worker through federal skilled worker. And then after that, potentially want to look at province specific if federal skilled worker is a little bit too high for you. And province specific are things like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, in which case job offers are not necessarily required. If you are able to find a job offer inside of Canada, then that would be great as well because you'd be able to come into Canada on a work permit. If you have a dependent child, then it would be accompanying on the application in both a permanent residency or even a work permit as well. Okay. Let's see if I missed any other questions from above. All right. I'm on a visa. How can I apply for a work permit? What is the best approach? This is a great question. I'm just going to repeat myself a little bit. I apologize, but I'm going to talk a little bit about um, the new program that's in place and that came into place during COVID, which is the LMIA from inside of Canada. So if you have a job offer and you're a visitor inside of Canada, then you would be able to apply for an LMIA, which is an employer-specific work permit from inside of Canada as well. Okay. Now, in terms of some topics I want to just discuss really quickly, because this has been a situation that's affected a lot of people in the past year, which is the lack of federal skilled worker and Canadian experience class draws. So both of these programs are skilled worker express entry applications. And it's put a lot of strain on a lot of people for two reasons. Number one is that if you had an application that was in process, whether it's 2019 or 2020, you're likely sitting in a backlog. And it's been a huge nightmare for a lot of people to try to get that application pulled to the forefront. And the second thing that people have been dealing with is with the lack of draws that have been coming. I think it's been I don't even know if it's been a year, but it's at least been a few months since we've had our last federal skilled worker draw that's come out. Those two things are related. So because of COVID, obviously, Immigration Canada has hit a backlog. And what they did in 2020 is they prioritized people who were inside of Canada already instead of people who are outside of Canada. Now, the issue with that is that a lot of people who basically had their life plans ready to go could not enter Canada because their PRs have been, even now, still in process almost 2 years, 2.5 years later. So now in 2022, Minister Sean Fraser said that he's going to prioritize the federal skilled worker applications, particularly those ones that have been stuck in the backlog. And as a result, I am very hopeful that we are going to see a bit of a surplus in terms of getting these applications approved for people outside of Canada under the federal skilled worker program. Besides that, the other thing that it's going to affect the federal skilled worker is likely the issue of the lack of draws. We've kind of been led on in terms of when these draws are going to happen. And right now, both Canadian experience class and federal skilled worker are hitting a little bit of a bump. Canadian experience class is rumored to come back in spring. We're officially in spring now, so whether that means tomorrow or in a month from now is uncertain. My general advice is if you have a profile ready to go and you're working on improving it, submit it anyway. And then over time, you want to improve it as you can. But I say this because I think we all learned a lesson from that 75 score draw that happened last year, which is the score was 75 CRS points, and they drew out essentially everybody out of Canadian experience class pool. So you never know. Maybe it could happen again, and maybe the next draw could even be 300 or 200 or even 400. So if you have a profile that's ready to go right now, just hit submit. You can always edit your profile later. But if a draw comes and it's a once-in-a-lifetime draw, you don't want to miss it. Now, with federal skilled worker, we have a little bit less clarity, but my assumption is hopefully by summertime, they're going to resume the draws. They just want to focus on clearing the backlog first. Okay, I'm just going to go back to some of the questions. What are the requirements for a startup business? I don't personally work in startup visas, so I can't really go through this. But I can tell you a little bit in terms of what some of the programs are, which is that you need to have a business plan in place. You need to have a certain amount of funds that you'd be able to invest into a business in Canada. You need to be eligible or able to hire a certain amount of Canadian workers at your business. And you should also take a look at which province that you want to settle in, because each province has its specific requirements. Most important requirement for you to look at is the financial one. So, for example, if you want to set up a business in Toronto, Ontario, in the Greater Toronto area, it's going to be significantly more investment that you need to put towards your business startup. Okay. The next question I have is, what are the available options to expedite an AOR for PR from January 2021? Great question. In terms of an AOR for PR, it really depends on the application, because each application goes to a specific office. So if you have an AOR for a PR application for a spousal sponsorship, then you're going to want to take a look at either submitting something through a web form, an email through the specific office. For sponsorship, the office, if you're doing something from outside of Canada, is Sydney, Nova Scotia. The office, if you're both inside of Canada, is CPC Mississauga. So I would first start with web forms and emails. As immigration lawyers, we have pretty good tricks and tips and direct contacts that we can really kind of reach out to and see, hey, what's the problem here? Another suggestion I have is to reach out to your MP if you're a PR in Canada. Or a citizen, and you're doing a sponsorship application, then maybe reach out to your MP and see. I can see that the person clarified it's an AOR for federal skilled worker from outside of Canada. Yeah, I mean, this is coming back to what I was just talking about before. The backlog is just insane for federal skilled worker. Honestly, what I would recommend is finding the email of the processing office that holds your application. And some way you can find that out if you don't have a lawyer is to apply through ATIP notes. But it would be helpful if you were to find someone who can help you find out where your application is first. Try to contact that office by email, and then, of course, continue to send web forms. I know it kind of seems like an uphill battle. Web forms are everyone's arch nemesis for the past year, because they are just either coming back completely standard and auto generic, or they are coming back saying, oh, we can't find your information, or they just cause difficulty. But you got to just stay persistent. The Minister of Immigration is aware that most people with federal skilled worker are delayed at least a year. So just keep going, keep putting in effort. And if you need to contact immigration lawyer, what they would do for you at that side would be to try to find the exact office and reach out to them directly. Okay. All right. So the next question is, I'm 39 years old. The NOC code is in a managerial position, and I have a CRS score of 430. Is it advisable to come to Canada for a 2-year graduate certificate to secure PR, or should I target other provinces? Well, first off, I'll say, obviously, it's up to you in terms of what's going to work best for your career. But in terms of what I think is probably the fastest way to get PR, if you have Canadian experience, I'm going to assume that you don't because you asked this question. But if you did, the best thing to do is just gain your 1 year of Canadian work experience and apply for PR directly through Canadian Experience Class. And if you don't, then I would still have a profile in the pool for federal skilled worker, because you never know. A CRS score of 430 is still a very competitive score for federal skilled worker, and it's highly competitive for Canadian Experience Class. So it's good. I would have a profile in there just in case. Should you target other provinces to study, or should you come to Ontario? So again, I mean, that's a little bit up to you in terms of what you want to study. I don't really recommend anybody just go study because just for the sake of it. The reason for that, obviously, is because it's incredibly expensive to be an international student. And if your study plan is not genuine, if your studies don't make sense and don't make sense in line of your future, your career path, then you might be faced with a refusal. And so just keep that in mind. Obviously, make everything something that you genuinely want to do. I wouldn't say that studying in Ontario versus Saskatchewan is a difference necessarily. You would rather want to focus on the program itself. The other thing to focus on study permits and the ways to really think about how can I ensure that this is going to be as close to an approval as possible is with regards to the study program vis-a-vis your own past education. So what I mean is if you have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, but then you're applying for a certificate inside of Canada, it doesn't make sense. You don't need a certificate if you have a master's degree and bachelor's degree. So always evaluate things in accordance to what your own experience is, and that way you're really going to get the best results. Okay. But I'll just add, because you talked about other provinces, if your CRS score is 430, perhaps look at Saskatchewan and Manitoba. They do have significantly lower requirements for CRS, and you don't need a job offer for those two provinces. Okay. Next question is, what is the age limit for Canadian PR? Great answer is that there is no limit. There's no limit for which you can apply for permanent residency in Canada. The only thing to keep in mind of is if you're looking to apply through a skilled worker position, Canada does kind of prioritize people who are in their mid-20s. That's kind of the sweet spot for having the highest scores possible. If you're over 40 years old, you don't necessarily get any points for your age, but whether you're 41 or 61 is not really going to make any difference. And if you are 95 years old, you still are eligible to apply for PR. Just take a look at what program you want to apply for, because potentially it's going to give you an advantage or disadvantage if you're a little bit more mature. We'll say that. Do I still need to get vaccinated to enter Canada? I'm from London. Short answer is yes. There are exceptions as to whether you can enter Canada and be unvaccinated. A couple of which would be urgent reasons, being a minor child, coming in as a refugee, and those kinds of situations, you would just be required to quarantine for 2 weeks. But if you're just coming as a tourist, you do need to be vaccinated. Okay. I'm a British citizen and I'm already here in Canada. How can I apply for a work permit? You should take a look at LMIA exempt applications. And an LMIA exempt would be really great for someone who's a UK citizen, because they do not necessarily need to go through the same job offer process that others do. And if you have a job offer in a skilled position, I would absolutely take a look at it. The other thing to take a look at, because we keep talking about skilled positions, is also skilled trades. I find that a lot of people come to Canada have skilled trade positions like carpentry and I really can't think of any other ones, but essentially skilled trade positions, something more in line with construction work and things like that. That would also be a really good option and something you can do from inside of Canada. But again, I really recommend to this person to take a look at the UK Canadian job opportunities for LMIA exempt work permits. That would be great. And you still have the ability to do it right now. The reason why I say that, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but it is to do with that new program that came out during COVID and it's been extended, where you can apply for a work permit from inside of Canada. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit. I said this already, that I'm going to bring it up at the end. And if you've been here at the beginning, I'm sorry that you're hearing this for the third time. But given it's really important, I don't want to have anybody miss out on it. But again, if you are Ukrainian, if you have a family friend or family member who is a Ukrainian citizen, Canada currently has Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel. They would be eligible to come to Canada as a visitor and also have their application prioritized, so expedited on a very quick basis. And when they're in Canada, they would be eligible for an open work permit for about 2 or 3 years, and you don't need a job offer. So just keep that in mind. Canada's really prioritizing it right now. And if you have someone who's potentially looking at, I need to get out of here, I'm in Poland, I'm kind of stranded, I'm in Turkey, I'm stranded, instead of just jumping to a refugee claim, because that's not necessarily what everybody wants to do, then I would absolutely take a look at Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel. I can tell you that my team specifically, we work a lot with advocacy and human rights-based applications, and we've been absolutely prioritizing those on our end as well. Okay. So some of the questions I can see are coming in. I'm just going to read them directly from the comment section. As a journalist, financial news reporter working remotely on contract for a US based agency with 462 points in the express entry pool, do I still have a good profile? I mean, you have 462 points. That's an excellent profile for federal skilled worker. You might be a little bit discouraged because you're not getting an invitation to apply. And in case you just joined, that's not anything to do with your points. That has to do with the fact that a federal skilled worker has been paused for a little while because they're trying to clear the backlog from 2019 and 2020. So you do have a good profile, absolutely. Um, the other things to take into consideration and ways to increase your score, the number one way is if you're married, what can your partner bring to the table? Do they have an IELTS that's been completed? Do they have work experience? Do they have education? And if you didn't put that in your profile already, try to take a look at including it. The second thing to look at is if you speak French. I mean, the speaking French is going to be just a cheat code for you to get your points a little bit higher. Canada's really trying to bring a lot more French speaking people as permanent residents into the country. So you would get significantly more points. Let's say on the same score you would get in English, it would give you more points if you had it in French. So if your French is even mediocre, it's probably worth it to do the test because you'll probably increase your points at least 5. So I would take a look at that. Um, if you are able to obtain further education, of course, that would be wonderful. But unfortunately, education inevitably takes a few months to a year to really gain anything to put on your application. And there's probably faster ways for you to be able to increase your score. But for 462, I would absolutely hang in there. It's competitive. I don't think it's going to meet the first draw of federal skilled worker that's going to come out. But if you have time and if you're patient, then I think over time you could get pulled out with 462. The other thing, of course, the last thing to look at is job opportunities. So if you are a journalist, if you could find a non-contract position inside of Canada, I find that those skills are quite transferable. So perhaps look at that as well, and you're going to certainly have a really high score. Okay. The next question I see is I worked in a private clinic during my course period. Will that be counted as work experience for EE? So during your course period, I'm assuming while you were a student. If you were inside of Canada when you studied this, no. Your experience as a student cannot be counted towards express entry, unfortunately. But from the moment that you graduate and submit an application for postgraduate work permit, then your work experience can begin. Okay. May I know the duration of a process for a fresh work visa from a software company if it's an ICT visa? I just need to know the duration of its process and when should we go for biometrics and stamping. I'm assuming you mean processing time from immigration. It does depend on the country that you're from. And let's say hypothetically you would be from India. Then you're looking at a few months. Everything is a little bit backlogged coming out of South Asia. So you should probably budget in for between 3 to 6 months for your ICT. Okay. The next question I had is coming back to the vaccination. I'm coming for a holiday. I don't have a vaccine. Can I apply for a visa for a job? Depends. It depends on what the job is, if you get a job offer, and what your country of citizenship is. Those are all little factors to consider. So, for example, if you're from a country that has a program in place with Canada, then you can look at that and potentially get an LMIA exempt work permit. If you're from a country that allows for something called IEC, which is International Experience Class, then you can get an open work permit through that. So it really does depend. Next question is there a possibility that the CRS score for federal skilled worker will drop for the year 2022? Good question. My assumption is no. I don't think that the first few draws are going to be low. I think they're going to be really high. But again, this is just a prediction. And the reason why I predict that is because they haven't pulled out for so long that when they do, it's going to be so many people who are going to be pulled out. And right now they need to focus on clearing the backlog. So in my opinion, it's going to start in the really high 400s, and then eventually, as things even out, they're going to come back to the mid 400s. 468, just as a side note, is still a good score. Anything above a 440 is a competitive score for federal skilled worker. You just need to budget some time for yourself to acknowledge that potentially it's not going to work out in the timeline you want it to. And a large part of that is just because of the backlog. I think they're going to start really high and then eventually come down. Now, by the end of December, if we've had more than 3 draws, then yeah, I think by 468, it's very possible by the end of December of this year. The same vaccination questions, just as a follow-up. Do I need a visa for a holiday? It depends on the country that you're from. And if you're from a country that requires a visa, then yes. If you're from a country that is visa exempt, then if you're flying in, you likely need an electronic travel authorization. And if you're a US citizen, you don't need that at all. Someone said I'm not answering their question. I absolutely will answer your question. If you could just type it in there, I apologize. Potentially I lost it. So just chat it again and I'll try to get to it for sure. Which French tests can increase the CRS score? All of the French tests. I think I'm going off memory, but I think they're called, I'm scared to even say it because I think it's wrong, but I think it's TOEFL. And then there's another one that essentially looks like TOEFL, but any of the registered immigration French tests you can complete. What I would do is probably just look on the CRS score calculator. I would check it right now if I could for you. But if you just check the CRS score calculator and see what the French options are for you, then potentially that's the best way to look for it. But any of those would be included on it. All right. Oops, I lost track of a lot of the questions that just came in the last few minutes. Any idea why people are leaving Canada? No, I mean, I don't know if people are leaving Canada, if that's true. Canada is a great place to live, and I'm a little bit biased, but I don't think there's something you should be concerned about. I think the most common reason why people leave Canada is because of taxes or business registration. It seems like the US is a little bit more lenient on those kinds of things, but there's nothing that's going on that you should be afraid of. I think a lot of people were upset, and I had a few clients who were disgruntled because of vaccination requirements and things like that, but things are really being lifted. So if that was a concern for you, it's probably not going to be that big of a concern in the future. Next question is, I am an engineer in mechanical sciences. I speak English and I don't have an IELTS. Can I be exempted from this language evaluation? No, unfortunately you can't. If you want to apply for a skilled worker position through Express Entry, IELTS is mandatory. So you will have to complete your IELTS, even if you're from the US and English is the only language you speak. It's still a requirement for everybody. Can people employed on contract basis, like news reporters for a US company, pass as self-employed? It's too difficult for me to say yes or no. It really just depends on the details of your contract. But generally, people who are on contract basis, if you're more of a freelancer providing services in which you're incorporated in yourself, then probably. But it's kind of a tough question for me to say yes or no if I don't see the documentation in front of me. But it's something to certainly explore if it's a possibility for you. I live in London. Do I need a visa for Canada? I'm going to assume you mean London, England. You need an electronic travel authorization if you're flying in. The next question is, I'm a British citizen and currently in Canada as a tourist. How long can I stay in Canada? First off, I hope you're having a good time as a tourist in Canada. And second of all, you can stay for about 6 months, but I would absolutely do 2 things. Number 1, check your electronic travel authorization if you flew in. And number 2 is check to see if the officer gave you a specific deadline. If they didn't, then you have 6 months to stay. That is the maximum time that you have as a visitor. And if you need to extend your time, absolutely do so before it expires. Otherwise, you'll be in a little bit of trouble and have difficulty coming back in. Okay. Now, the last question I'm going to take is this one. My question was missed and the response was, you will address this at the end. Okay, I'll address it now. So the question was about a CR1 visa versus K1. Which option allows? Oh, this is why I skipped it. So I'm a Canadian immigration lawyer. I'm not able to answer about US matters, but I'm going to finish the question and see what I can do to help you. So the question was about a CR1 visa versus K1. Which option allows me to stay in the US longer as we await processing? Will I lose my passport after the interview? Um, Leanne, I'm so sorry. I don't have the answer just because I'm not a US immigration lawyer, but we do have US immigration lawyers at the firm. We have a whole department that deals with US law. So if you ever wanted to call into the office, they would schedule a consultation for you and you can find that out. But I apologize. I wish I could get to your question, especially because you've been so patient to get to it. If you have any questions about Canadian, I'll try to answer it before we end this live as well. All right, I was going to log off, but I'm going to try to just get two more questions in here. Other than points being impacted, would my profile be frowned upon if my wife's education says none, but we've both scored CLB 10 on IELTS? No, it's not going to be frowned upon. If you don't have the education documents to prove her education, then that's okay. You can just claim that she doesn't have education to put. What I would do is when you get an invitation to apply for PR, I would just put a letter of explanation and say that you couldn't claim her education because you've lost the documentation. CLB 10 on IELTS is excellent. So I would stay positive and think that that's going to be fine. But absolutely will not be frowned upon. That's okay. Just provide a letter of explanation. About the study route, can I bring my family on the same flight as mine when entering Canada newly? It depends who's your family. You can't bring your parents if you're an adult. But if you have children, then yes, they can accompany you. If you have a spouse, yes, they can accompany you. If you have a spouse, they can accompany you as an open work permit holder if you're a student, and your kids can come as visitors. Minor children don't always need a study permit, even if they're going to be enrolled in school. A visitor visa should be sufficient, and most of the schools in Canada are very well aware of how that system works. Last question is: I have an ETA and I'm a British citizen. How can I change my tourist visa to a work visa? I would look at three things. Number one is IEC. Number two is LMIA exempt work permit. And number three is regular LMIA route. As a UK citizen, you have a lot of opportunities in terms of getting a work permit. So I would absolutely take a look at that and see based off what your job opportunity or job offer can be. And then from there, dissect it down to, is this LMIA exempt or is it not? There's currently the program in place in which you can apply for an LMIA or LMIA exempt work permit from inside of Canada. So I would absolutely take advantage of that if you could. All right, I've talked my way through this 1 hour. Thank you everybody who has stayed around for the full hour. I hope that I was able to answer a little bit. Thank you guys as well for your participation. I really appreciate all the questions that came in. Again, my name is Nadia. I'm one of the associate lawyers here. So if you ever call in to our office, then just let reception know or let intake know that you want to chat with me. And I'm always more than happy to just book a consultation and chat with clients. And if you have any other questions, just again, feel free to reach out to our firm. But beyond that, have a wonderful weekend. And thank you guys so much for your time.